They laughed at him. J.D. Vance, standing there in a tailored suit, was called a fraud, a political actor playing dress-up in someone else's pain. Jasmine Crockett didn't just question his record. She ridiculed his past, said he didn't know what real struggle looked like. But he didn't argue. He didn't defend. Instead, he opened a plain manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper from 1994. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't rehearsed. It was a food stamp, old, creased, nearly falling apart. And with that, the laughter stopped. Phones went still. Even his harshest critics froze, as if the oxygen had been pulled from the room. Because in that moment, it wasn't about party lines or headlines. It was about a memory, a truth, a boy who'd known hunger, who never forgot what it cost to survive. And suddenly, the entire room wasn't debating policy. They were staring at proof. Proof of a life they couldn't erase. What you're about to see isn't a news report. It's a story. A dramatized retelling, shaped by imagination but grounded in the emotions many Americans know too well. The names may shift, the dialogue may soar, but the heart of it, the hunger, the memory, the silence that says more than any speech, that part is real. This isn't meant to report the world exactly as it happened. It's meant to remind us what it feels like to live in it. Stay with us, because some stories don't just ask for your time, they earn it. The room was cold, but the tension made it feel like fire. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the House Subcommittee on Economic Justice, where two names sat silently at opposite ends of a polished mahogany panel. Jasmine Crockett, bold, sharp, unapologetic, and J.D. Vance, expression unreadable, posture still as stone. Cameras were already rolling, not for legislation. That was just background noise. No, today was theater, and every news outlet in the country had shown up for the main act. J.D.'s hands were folded neatly on a stack of notes he hadn't touched. He wasn't new to pressure. He'd faced worse in courtrooms, in headlines, in the quiet funeral of his mother. But today was different. This time, the attack wouldn't come from across the aisle. It would come from a place that claimed to fight for the same people he said he did. Crockett leaned forward, her fingers steepled like a chess player closing in. Then she said it. Slow, steady, deliberate. Mr. Vance, with all due respect, you can't pretend to speak for the poor when you've never lived it. The words dropped like steel in water. Instant ripple. One congressman shifted uncomfortably. Another suppressed a smirk. But the laughter? That came from the press bench. Not loud, not cruel. Worse, amused. J.D. didn't blink. He didn't move. His jaw flexed just once. Crockett sat back in her chair, satisfied, like someone who just landed the first blow in a televised boxing match. Her tone was rehearsed, even elegant, but her eyes said it was personal. You wear that story like a costume, she added, voice lighter now, almost playful. But the real poor? They don't have the luxury of writing memoirs about it. They're too busy surviving. Gasps. Laughter again. Even the CS-Pan camera lingered on J.D.'s face, waiting, hoping for a crack, a retort, a flinch. There was none. Instead, he reached for a glass of water, slowly, calmly, took one sip. Then he looked straight ahead, not at her, but through her. Outside the chamber, the quote hit Twitter like a thunderclap. A Hill intern clipped the moment and posted it with the caption, "Crockett just ended J.D. Vance." Within 30 minutes, it had 12,000 shares, a trending hashtag he never lived it, and a wave of pundits dissecting whether his silence was guilt or restraint. But inside the room, something else was happening. J.D.'s aide seated behind him whispered, "Do you want to respond?" He didn't turn. He just whispered back, "Not yet." There was something in the stillness of his eyes. Not pride, not pain, memory. He glanced down at his notes, then past them, to something tucked quietly in his folder. A piece of paper, faded at the edges. It had waited there for 30 years. He hadn't planned to show it today. But now, maybe it was time. On the far wall, a photo of the American flag fluttered in a glass frame. Below it, carved into the wood, "In witness of the people's truth." The hearing went on, but the room had already shifted. People didn't know why. Not yet, but they could feel it. And somewhere, buried under layers of silence and cameras and performance, a truth was stirring. Because the question wasn't just, has J.D. Vance lived it? The question now was, what if he has and never told us? The door clicked shut behind him, but J.D. didn't speak. His staff knew better than to ask. He walked past them like a man underwater. Tie loosened, fingers running along the wall as if tracing something only he could feel. Not anger, not defeat, just, wait. Inside his office, the lights stayed off. He didn't need them. The glow from the monitor was enough. He sat down slowly, turned the screen toward him, and clicked play. There it was again. The moment. Jasmine Crockett's voice, sharp and clear. You can't pretend to speak for the poor when you've never lived it. He rewound. Played it again. You wear that story like a costume. Again. The laughter. He leaned back in his chair. No reaction, just watching. Like a detective revisiting a cold case. Except this one wasn't a mystery. It was memory. His eyes drifted down to the edge of the desk, where a stack of briefing notes sat unread. Beneath them, almost invisible, was a thin, tan envelope. He slid it out with slow fingers, like lifting something sacred. In the top left corner, written in faded ink and careful block letters, 1994 snap. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Instead, his gaze fixed on the wall, or rather through it, as if the office around him dissolved, brick by brick, and rebuilt itself into another place entirely. A different room, dimly lit, smaller, colder, a kitchen in Middletown, Ohio. The window was covered with plastic sheeting, the kind taped down with hope and dollar store insulation. A drip echoed faintly from the faucet. Not that it mattered. The water hadn't run in 2 days. On the floor, a milk crate held 3 cans, one of beans, one of generic peaches, one unmarked. The label had peeled off in a spill weeks ago. They'd been too scared to open it. 10-year-old J.D. sat at the table, knees pulled to his chest. His mother stood across from him, counting food stamps on the counter. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from how hard she was trying not to look like she was shaking. "This'll get us through Thursday," she said, more to herself than to him. Her voice was strained, brittle with fatigue, scratchy from too many Marlboros smoked in silence. The stove behind her hissed softly. Only one burner worked now, and it had to be lit with a match. J.D. knew this because he was the one who lit it. She finished counting, slid the booklet back into her purse, and ruffled his hair. He smiled, not because anything was funny, but because he knew it helped her pretend. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Familiar, hollow. J.D. remembered that sound more than most lullabies. Back in the present, he blinked hard and let the memory settle. The envelope sat between his fingers, its edges worn and softened by time. He didn't cry. He never cried over this. But for a moment, he let himself feel it. Not out of weakness, but because the world had just told him it wasn't real, that he'd made it up. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to prove otherwise. He stood up, placed the envelope gently into a clean folder, and looked out the window of his office. Capitol Hill glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. They thought silence meant surrender, but they forgot. Silence can hold stories sharper than any headline. The envelope was back in the drawer. J.D. closed it carefully as if tucking away a fragile piece of bone. Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the Capitol dome, spilling long shadows across the carpet. The office, still dark except for a desk lamp, felt more like a confessional than a workplace. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was Lucas, J.D.'s senior aide, late 30s, sharp-eyed, loyal in that quiet, unflinching way that staffers rarely got credit for. He stepped in slowly, laptop under his arm, expression careful. "The clip's gone viral," he said without preamble. "MSNBC already ran it twice. Trending on X, hashtag he never lived it." J.D. didn't flinch, just nodded once. Lucas continued. "They're loving it. Everyone thinks Crockett landed the knockout. I'd suggest we let this one blow over, stay above it. No statement, no response." There was a pause, long enough to feel like a challenge. JD turned in his chair and looked directly at him. "She thinks I'm pretending because I wear a suit," he said quietly. "That's the costume she never saw coming." Lucas blinked. "I'm not writing a statement," JD added. "I'm writing something else." He opened a drawer and pulled out a weathered notebook. Not the kind staffers use, not leather-bound or camera-ready. This one was spiral-bound, spine half-bent, pages filled with crossed-out thoughts and sketches from another life. He flipped past grocery lists, half-formed ideas, an old note to himself that read, "Don't forget where you came from, even when they do." He found a blank page. Then, like muscle memory returning to a soldier, he started writing. No preamble, no outline. Just a pen moving like it had something to prove. The first line came fast. "I didn't choose poverty, but I carried it, and it never really let go." He paused, tapped the pen, then kept going. Outside the window, traffic slowed, headlights flickering like small truths trying to find their way through the city. In the hallway, someone laughed. JD didn't hear it. He wrote about his mom, not as a saint, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who did what she could with what little the world left her. He wrote about the plastic-covered windows, the dinners that came from cans without labels, and the strange dignity of wearing clean clothes held together by safety pins. They think pain looks a certain way, but pain wears uniforms too, sometimes pressed, sometimes frayed, sometimes with a name tag, sometimes with cufflinks. The words flowed, faster now, not for applause, not even for vindication, but because something in him needed to answer not Crockett, not the media, but the lie that had followed him since the campaign trail, that just because he'd made it, he must have started somewhere easier. Lucas watched for a moment longer, then turned to leave. Before he reached the door, JD said without looking up, "We're not sending this to press. Not yet." Lucas paused. "Then what's it for?" JD kept writing. "It's for me. First. Then we'll see." The pen moved again, each stroke quieter, sharper, deeper. Because sometimes before you speak to the world, you have to remind yourself where your voice was born. And for JD Vance, it had never come from a podium. It had come from silence, from the thread that never snapped, only stretched. And now finally, it was pulling him back towards something real. And as JD scribbled the first lines of a speech he hadn't dared write in years, a memory stirred, unfolding not in words but in the dim hum of a fluorescent light from decades ago. Middletown, 1994. Before the suits, before the speeches, before the marble halls and talking points, there was fluorescent light, cold, flickering, and loud in the way only silence can be. It buzzed over JD's head like a warning. He stood in the checkout line at the corner food right, a wrinkled yellow basket at his feet. In it, a loaf of off-brand white bread, a jar of peanut butter with a dented lid, and a box of powdered milk that crunched faintly when he picked it up. Everything was chosen for price, not preference, a lesson he'd already learned by age 10. His mother wasn't with him. She was home, curled under a pile of blankets in the back room, her breath shallow, her eyes hollow. The breakdown had started 2 days earlier. Sudden, quiet, like something folding in on itself. JD had tried not to be scared. He was used to shifts in her moods. But this one felt different, like something had gone out in her and hadn't come back on. So he'd gone to the kitchen drawer, found the blue booklet she kept clipped with a paperclip, and walked the 5 blocks to the store. He didn't think. He just moved. He didn't feel brave. He just knew the fridge was empty. He approached the register with slow, deliberate steps. The cashier was young, maybe a high schooler, maybe not, with braces and a bored expression. She scanned the bread, the peanut butter, the milk. The register beeped. JD flinched each time. Then came the pause. She looked at the food stamps in his trembling hands. She didn't say anything cruel, didn't smirk, but her voice took on that tone, the one adults use when they feel sorry for you, but don't want to look like it. "Go ahead and tear out the next one," she said gently. He did. His fingers fumbled. The paper tore unevenly. The moment stretched thin. She took the torn voucher without comment, rang it up, and handed him the change. A few coins and a printed receipt. Don't forget the receipt, she added in the same polite, practiced voice. He nodded. But he didn't just take the receipt. He studied it. Total, $7.26. Paid, $8 in food stamps. Change due, 74 cents. He folded it once, then again, until it was the size of a matchbook. Slid it into his back pocket like something sacred. He didn't know why. Not yet. But something in him whispered, "You'll need this one day." Outside, the sky was a steel gray blanket. He walked home slowly, kicking gravel, careful not to crush the bread. The plastic bag thumped against his leg in rhythm with his thoughts. He wasn't embarrassed. Not exactly. It was something more complicated. Not shame, but visibility. The strange discomfort of being seen for something he didn't choose. At the front steps, he paused. The door creaked when he pushed it open. The house smelled like old coffee and sleeping pills. In the back room, his mother hadn't moved. He set the bag on the counter, unpacked it one item at a time, and lit the one working burner with a wooden match. The flame popped to life. Weak, but enough. Then he sat at the kitchen table, pulled the folded receipt from his pocket, and placed it flat in front of him. Not to study it, not to admire it, just to remember. Because one day someone would say, "You've never lived it," and he'd need something to remind himself they were wrong. It wasn't the first time JD had sat through class without speaking, but it might have been the first time someone noticed. Mr. Daniels was the kind of teacher other students called boring. He wore the same brown corduroy blazer 3 days a week, had chalk dust permanently smeared on his cuffs, and used the phrase literary dignity more than any middle schooler could tolerate. But he watched, and he remembered, and that made him dangerous, because he saw what others didn't. JD had turned in a writing assignment late, 2 days past the deadline, folded into quarters, with pencil smudges along the margins. He'd written about a busted toaster and a dog that wasn't really his, but followed him home sometimes. There was no clear plot, just observations, honest ones. Daniels didn't mark it down. He called him after class. "You ever read Steinbeck?" the teacher asked. JD shrugged. "Don't think so." Daniels reached into his satchel, pulled out a paperback so used it looked like it had survived a flood. On the cover, "Of Mice and Men." "It's not pretty," Daniels said, "but neither is life. Sometimes ugly stories are the truest kind." JD hesitated. "Do I have to write a report?" Daniels smiled. "No, just read it. And don't let anyone tell you it's only for honors kids." JD took it home tucked under his jacket. Not because it was forbidden, but because it felt like it should be. That night he read by flashlight, crouched in a narrow hall closet with a broken door latch. It was where he went when things got loud. His mom's boyfriend had started shouting again. Football on the TV, cans clattering in the sink. The closet muted it all. He called it his thinking room. The walls were lined with old coats and a cracked shelf stacked with junk. Batteries that didn't work, a rusted tin of nails, a torn phone book from 1987. But in that moment, with the flashlight beam steady and the words on the page pulling him somewhere else, it felt like a library. Lenny and George were different than anyone he'd read about. They weren't superheroes. They weren't even good at surviving. But they tried. They moved. They dreamt of rabbits and soft things and land. JD didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. He didn't stop reading until the flashlight dimmed. Then he flipped to the inside back cover and scribbled something in pencil. "If I make it out, I'll carry the shelf with me." He didn't know what that meant yet. Not exactly. But he knew the shelf, that cracked, forgotten plank of wood, held more than nails and junk. It held moments no one else would see. It held the version of him that no test or lecture would ever grade. The next day he returned the book. Daniels didn't ask what he thought of it. Didn't need to. Instead, he nodded and said only one thing. "Just don't stop." Even when no one's looking. JD didn't answer. But something inside him clicked, like a match struck in the dark. And even years later, in rooms far grander than that closet, he would remember the echo of those pages and the roughness of that shelf. Because survival had taught him many things. But stories? Stories taught him how to carry what no one else saw. The light in JD's office had shifted to a softer hue. golden from the setting sun, diffused across his desk through half-drawn blinds. It cast long shadows over the shelves behind him, books and legal files catching pieces of warmth that the Capitol rarely offered in its language. He sat alone, the door gently closed behind him. No aides, no cameras, just quiet. The kind of quiet where thoughts don't echo. They settle. The envelope was no longer hidden in a drawer. It lay in front of him now, open like an old wound that had never truly scabbed over. He reached in and pulled out the food stamp. Faded, yellowed, but intact. At some point over the years, he'd had it laminated. Maybe to protect it. Maybe to admit to himself that he wasn't going to let it go. The edges were smooth now, sealed beneath plastic like an artifact from another life, which in some ways it was. A receipt of survival. A document never meant for display. Just meant to be enough for dinner. He held it between both hands and stared at it for a long while. His face gave nothing away, but inside there was movement. Not rage, not shame, just motion. Memory moving toward purpose. Then slowly he reached for a clean manila folder from his desk drawer, the kind used for legislative briefs or floor statements. On the front, in small black letters, he wrote a single word: evidence. He slid the laminated food stamp inside, pressing it flat, his hand lingering as if sealing a contract with something unspoken. Not vengeance, not vindication, but the truth. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose, the breath slow and steady. Just then, his cell phone buzzed on the desk. No ringtone, just vibration, a quiet insistence. He glanced at the screen. It was a political reporter from one of the big three networks. She'd covered his Senate run, grilled him in a now famous interview, and once called his life story a masterclass in curated grit. He answered, voice calm, without even clearing his throat. Vance. Senator, I won't take much of your time. I'm sure you've seen the footage. Congresswoman Crockett's remarks today are everywhere. Networks, social, you name it. Do you have a response? JD looked out the window for a moment, as if measuring the temperature of the sky. Then he replied evenly, I'll answer when it matters. There was a pause on the other end. Senator, with respect, when will that be? When words stop being louder than memory. He ended the call before she could say more. Not out of arrogance, but because anything more would dilute the meaning. The phone went dark again. JD reached for the folder, tapped it once on the desk to straighten the contents, then placed it carefully inside his briefcase. Not a weapon, not a shield, just a reminder. Outside, Washington moved on as it always did. Traffic humming, windows glowing in neighboring offices, headlines rewriting themselves by the hour. But inside this quiet corner of the Capitol, something had shifted. JD hadn't raised his voice, hadn't fired back. And yet, somehow the answer had already begun. Because sometimes you don't need to respond to noise. You just need to hold on to what can't be argued with, and wait for the moment it finally matters. The studio lights hit hard, even for a Sunday morning. Jasmine Crockett sat poised in the center chair on the set of Capitol Roundtable, a polished political talk show with a reputation for drawing blood behind soft smiles. The backdrop was all red, white, and brushed metal. The host, sharp-suited, perfectly neutral, leaned in for the setup. Congresswoman, you've had a lot to say about Senator J.D. Vance this week. You want to clarify that? Jasmine didn't flinch. She folded her hands, leaned slightly forward, and smiled. The kind of smile that always comes just before the jab. I'll say this, she began smoothly, her voice relaxed but loaded. He built a campaign on being poor, wrote a book about it, quoted his mother's addiction, stood on stages telling America how hard he had it. She let that sentence hang just long enough. But when I look at him now, I don't see poor. I see a man who wears other people's pain like a tailored jacket. Scattered applause broke out. Not thunderous, but enough. Enough to say the crowd was listening and enjoying it. The host raised an eyebrow. So, you're saying it's political theater? No, she said with mock sincerity. I'm saying it's branding, and I don't buy it. The panelists chuckled. The chyron at the bottom of the screen pulsed. Crockett, Vance is selling struggle like a product. The moment was sharp, perfectly packaged. 30 seconds of clean media soundbite, ready to be clipped, shared, weaponized. One of the producers off-screen gave a subtle thumbs up. 3 states away, the TV volume in a diner booth was low, but the visuals were enough. J.D. Vance sat alone in a back corner of an old roadside diner just off Route 35 in Ohio. The kind of place with sticky laminated menus, a bell that rang when the kitchen door swung open, and coffee poured by a woman named Jan, who called everyone Han, whether they were senators or steelworkers. He didn't react. His plate sat untouched in front of him. Scrambled eggs gone cold, rye toast curling at the edges. The coffee was black, half full, no cream. He watched the screen without blinking, without shifting. The diner's lighting was dim enough to cast shadows under his eyes, but not dark enough to hide how still he was. A young man seated in the next booth over glanced at him, did a quick double take, then turned away. JD didn't notice, or didn't care. Back on the TV, Jasmine's segment wrapped up. The host thanked her for her candor, and the panel moved on to international markets. JD finally blinked. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded notepad. Flipped to a half-written page. Read a single line, one he'd scribbled days earlier. They say I'm too polished to be poor, as if pain can't wear a clean shirt. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just stared at it. John appeared beside him and topped off his coffee. You want me to warm that plate, sweetheart? He looked up finally, eyes softening, just a touch. No thanks, he said. I'm just thinking. She smiled, patted his shoulder gently, and walked away. The coffee steamed in front of him, and somewhere deep inside, the man they said had never lived it. Something was getting ready to speak. Not in anger, but in memory. The cemetery was quiet, tucked behind a row of sycamores that bent eastward with the wind, as if they too had learned to lean through hardship. The air carried that familiar chill of early spring. Not quite winter, not yet warm. A season caught between memory and renewal. JD stood alone among the stones. No cameras, no entourage. Just him and the silence he knew too well. His coat collar was turned up, hands deep in his pockets, one of them gripping a plastic grocery bag that crinkled faintly with every step. Row by row, he passed names carved in gray. Families he'd known, classmates long buried. His mother's headstone was modest, no script, no etched roses, just the essentials. Beverly Ann Vance, 1965 to 2003, loved, troubled, never forgotten. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. The wind moved through the grass like a low breath. He glanced down at the Kroger bag in his hand. Faded blue logo, edges worn thin, knotted at the top with a clumsy twist. The plastic had yellowed over time, as if it too had aged in grief. He knelt slowly, knees brushing against the wet earth, and placed the bag at the base of the headstone with a care so gentle it looked like reverence. Inside was a single object, a dented can of beans, the last item his mother had bought with food stamps before the breakdown that changed everything. He had found it buried in the back of her pantry after she died, tucked behind cleaning supplies and a box of old envelopes. It had no expiration date left, just a faded price sticker and a rusting rim. He'd never opened it, never would. Some things weren't meant to feed the body. They were meant to feed the memory. He sat back on his heels, eyes on the stone, jaw tight. His breath came out slow and controlled, visible in the air like smoke from a fire, long put out, but still smoldering inside. They laugh at pain they've never tasted, he whispered. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something lower, more dangerous, certainty. He reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the stone, as if to feel something beneath the surface. His thumb grazed the first letter of her name. They think it's a story, he murmured. But it was dinner. It was heat. It was whether you and I could make it to Friday. His hand dropped back to his lap. He sat there a while longer, the world around him quiet but not empty. In his pocket, his phone buzzed once. Probably another request for comment, another chance to defend his past with sound bites and clean language. He didn't check it. Instead, he looked down at the bag, the can visible through stretched plastic like a relic behind glass, and felt something shift inside him. Not resolve exactly, something older, something closer to inheritance. He rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his pants, and stood looking down at the grave one last time. "I don't need them to believe me," he said aloud. "I just need them to hear me." The wind picked up, carrying his words out across the headstones like a promise or a warning. Then he turned and walked away, the echoes of laughter still chasing him from the halls of power, but no longer touching him where it counted. The drive back into D.C. was uneventful, but something in J.D.'s grip on the steering wheel said otherwise. He didn't play music, didn't take calls. The road stretched ahead like an old argument, familiar, worn, yet full of blind turns. The skyline greeted him without emotion, the Capitol dome standing still as stone in the fading afternoon light. His office lights were off when he entered. He preferred it that way lately. Too much brightness made it hard to think. He loosened his tie but didn't take off his coat. The silence welcomed him like an old friend. He sat down, opened his drawer, and took out the folder, the one labeled Evidence. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just let it sit in front of him like a quiet challenge. Across the room, his phone rested on its charging dock. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up and tapped a contact near the top of the screen. Committee Clerk, Econ Justice Sub. The phone rang twice before a bright, brisk voice answered. "Clerk's office, this is Amelia." J.D.'s voice was calm, controlled. "This is Senator Vance. I want to request 3 minutes during the next hearing. No more." There was a slight pause, then, "3 minutes to speak?" "Yes, no introduction, no rebuttal, just uninterrupted time." Another pause. "That's highly unusual, Senator." "So was being called a fraud on record. I won't need long." The clerk cleared her throat. "We'll make space." "Thank you." He hung up without waiting for confirmation. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No storm clouds rolled in, but something had cracked open inside him. Not a wound, but a window. He pulled his notepad closer, flipped to a blank page, and uncapped his pen. There was no hesitation this time. The ink touched paper as if it had waited years for this moment. He wrote just one line at first. "They laugh because silence makes them nervous." He stared at it, the words settling like dust over old furniture. Then he added the second. "Let's make them listen to it." He underlined listen. This wasn't going to be a fiery rebuttal or a headline soundbite. This would be something else, something slower, more dangerous. He knew what 3 minutes could feel like when the room was tense. He'd watched judges pause for less. He'd seen military officers deliver life-altering truths in half that time. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to remind them, and maybe himself, that some truths don't roar. They resonate. He tapped the folder once with his fingertips. Still sealed. Still waiting. In the hallway beyond his door, voices passed. Staffers moving from one crisis to the next. Interns with clipboards and coffee. Policy advisors talking in acronyms and strategy. But inside J.D.'s office, there was no movement. Just preparation. Just silence thickening like a tide before it turns. He set the notepad aside and glanced once more at the Capitol outside his window. Gold-tipped and gleaming, even as the sun threatened to disappear. 3 minutes. That's all he'd asked for. But if he used them right, 3 minutes would be all he needed. The briefing room wasn't large, but it was efficient. One long glass table, 3 leather chairs on each side, and a whiteboard still smudged with graphs from a forgotten fiscal rollout. J.D. sat at the head, sleeves rolled to the elbows, folder in front of him like a sealed threat. No one had dared ask what was in it. Around him were the voices he paid to be smart, fast, and deeply skeptical. Gabe, his campaign strategist, was the first to speak. Late 40s, eternally frowning, always one step ahead of headlines. He tapped his pen on the table like a countdown. "You want to bring up food stamps in a hearing? You're a senator now, J.D. That plays fine on the way up. Not when you're already in the room." J.D. didn't answer. A younger consultant, Maddie, data-driven, Harvard-trained, leaned forward. Her tone was polite, but the edge was hard. "It reads like a setup, Senator. If you go there, they'll frame it as pity bait. You know the game. Man with power milks past pain to win sympathy. JD looked down at the folder, tapped it once with his fingers. Good, he said quietly. Let's see how far they can spin what fed me. Silence. Gabe blinked. Maddie exhaled. JD, Gabe said more cautiously, I'm not saying your story isn't real, but politics isn't memory, it's projection. You bring out a food stamp, even if it's yours, and it stops being a fact. It becomes a frame, one you don't control. JD leaned back in his chair, not defensive, not angry, just tired of playing chess with his own past. They already framed me, he said. They did it with a laugh and a hashtag, so now they get my answer, and I won't need more than 3 minutes. Another staffer, quiet until now, cleared his throat. We're just asking you to think strategically. I am. JD stood up slowly, straightened his sleeves, and walked to the window. Outside, the Capitol stood like it always did. Beautiful, unmoved, indifferent. You think I'm trying to win the room, he said. I'm not. Maddie hesitated. Then what are you trying to win? He turned, met her eyes. The silence that follows. She didn't respond. He walked back to the table and picked up the folder, holding it like something both fragile and heavy. His voice dropped, low and level. You all work in messaging, but this, he held up the folder. This isn't a message, it's a memory, and I don't need it to trend, I just need it to land. Gabe rubbed his forehead, reluctant but retreating. You'll get 3 minutes, but we can't clean up what happens if it goes wrong. JD looked at him. Then let it go wrong. No one spoke after that. He left the room with the folder in hand, footsteps measured, spine straight. The hallway outside was lined with portraits of past senators. Smiling, polished, each one frozen in the glow of their era. JD didn't look at them. He had his own legacy to answer to, and it wasn't framed on a wall. It was sealed in a manila folder, and it was hungry to be heard. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a sagging one-story house on the edge of East Palestine, a town that hadn't made national headlines since the train derailment, and even then, only for a few days. After that, it went back to being what it had always been, a dot on a map, a punchline to no one in particular. JD stepped out slowly, his boots hitting the gravel with a familiar crunch. The house in front of him looked tired, but not abandoned. The porch sagged slightly to the left, a rusted flag holder jutted out from the siding, and an American flag, faded but still intact, flapped lazily in the wind. No show, just presence. On the porch sat a man with a body built by war and a face carved by the years that followed. His skin was weathered, his beard gray and short, and his left leg ended just above the knee. The prosthetic he wore was plain, no decals, no polish, just function. He didn't rise when JD approached, just nodded once, slow and deliberate. Didn't think you'd come back here, the man said, voice graveled and steady. JD climbed the porch steps and sat beside him, not asking if it was okay. The silence between them was the kind men carry when too much has been said in too many forgotten towns. Had to, JD replied. This place doesn't leave you. The man chuckled once. Dry, short. No, it doesn't, even when it should. They sat there a moment, watching dust dance in the light. Then the veteran turned, looked JD dead in the eye and said, They forgot us, son. You didn't. JD didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The air between them was full of unspoken agreements, things that didn't need ceremony or headlines. The man reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a folded envelope, thick with something handwritten inside. What's this? JD asked softly. A letter, the man said. Wrote it a while back. Figured I'd know when to give it. He placed it in JD's hands. No explanation, no pressure. Read it when they start to doubt who you fight for. JD nodded once, no words, and slid the envelope into the inside pocket of his coat. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a reminder. The man leaned back in his chair, joints cracking. We don't need you to win arguments in D.C. We need you to remember what it was like to lose out here, quietly, without notice, without noise. JD looked out across the gravel drive, to the dying cornfields beyond, and gave a quiet answer. I haven't forgotten. The veteran tapped the armrest with his knuckles. Then don't speak for us, speak with us. There's a difference. JD stood slowly. No handshake, no goodbye. Just a nod, one that meant everything and didn't require more. He stepped off the porch and back toward the truck, the letter warm in his pocket. He didn't open it. Not yet. Because some words aren't meant to be read in the moment. They're meant to anchor you when the whole world tries to pull you off course. By the time JD entered the hearing room, every seat was filled. The gallery was tighter than usual. Aides shoulder to shoulder, reporters hunched over notepads and smartphones, camera crews already in place with red tally lights glowing. The hearing wasn't officially scheduled to start for another 10 minutes, but no one was paying attention to the agenda. Everyone was waiting for the moment, the one they didn't know yet but could feel coming. JD moved with quiet precision. No entourage, no press statement, just the soft thud of his boots on marble and the slight creak of his chair as he took his seat at the long, curved table. His suit was simple. No flag pin, no pocket square, just fabric and weight. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat with her usual poise, back straight, chin slightly lifted, expression composed with just enough curve in the lips to register confidence. When she saw him, her eyes sharpened. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, like a player acknowledging an opponent across the chessboard. She assumed he'd come to fold, to smooth it over, to clarify. And why wouldn't she? She had the headlines, the clips, the laughter, the momentum. JD said nothing. He didn't even glance her way. Instead, he placed a plain manila folder on the desk in front of him. No label, no markings, nothing else. Just that. It sat there like a sealed verdict, drawing the gaze of anyone who noticed. A low murmur passed through the gallery, whispers trying to decode what might be inside. No laptop, no notes, no stack of printed talking points, just that one folder. Jasmine leaned slightly toward her aide, whispered something with a small shake of her head, then returned to her pose. She wasn't worried. Not yet. But she was watching now. Chairman Dalton cleared his throat at the center of the panel, tapped his gavel lightly, and began the procedural formalities. Today's continuation of the subcommittee hearing on economic justice will resume with final member statements and additional testimony submissions. JD didn't hear the rest. Not really. He already knew what he was going to say, or rather, what he wasn't. He ran his fingers once along the edge of the folder, feeling the ridge of the sealed flap. It was the same folder that had followed him from office to diner, from grave to porch. It hadn't been opened since he placed the contents inside. To his left, a young intern in a navy suit fidgeted with a pen. To his right, a political reporter adjusted her earpiece, watching JD's every movement through the corner of her lens. The air in the room thickened with anticipation. No one could explain why, but they all felt it. Because silence, real silence, doesn't need volume to grow heavy. It just needs presence. JD didn't reach for the mic, didn't clear his throat. He simply waited. Let the noise of the room move around him like a current he no longer had to fight. And as the chairman turned his attention toward him and said, "Senator Vance, I understand you've requested a brief statement." JD nodded once. Then finally, without words, he placed his hand atop the folder. Because before a storm breaks, there's always that one moment, the one no one notices until it's gone. Stillness. JD didn't rush. He waited until the room's usual background hum, the quiet coughs, chair squeaks, paper shuffles, fell into something close to reverent stillness. Then, with both hands placed lightly on the table's edge, he leaned forward and spoke without the microphone. Yet his voice carried. Congresswoman Crockett said, "I've never lived poverty." A pause. One heartbeat longer than expected. She's right. Every journalist raised their eyebrows. Some whispered, almost disappointed by what sounded like surrender. But JD continued. I didn't live poverty. I survived it. The silence that followed wasn't confused. It was startled. The kind of silence that seeps into the seams of a hearing room and makes even staffers forget to type. The kind of silence that made cameras instinctively zoom in, framing JD's face tight enough to catch the breath leaving his lips. JD didn't flinch. He reached for the manila folder, the one that had traveled from his childhood to this moment, and opened it slowly, with the care of someone handling something sacred. He pulled out a small, worn square, laminated but visibly aged, a 1994 SNAP food stamp. The ink was faded, but the numbers were still legible. The corners were creased. On the back, a faint pencil marking remained, a scribble from a school notebook JD hadn't remembered writing until he found it again last month. He placed it on the table, carefully aligning it with the wood grain, and slid it forward, directly in front of the microphone, directly into the camera's view. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of audible gasps moved through the committee like wind passing over wheat. A Capitol photographer, standing in the press box, instinctively dropped to one knee to get a better angle. The flash went off twice, then again. JD didn't look at the cameras. He looked directly across the table. Jasmine Crockett was no longer smiling. Her posture hadn't changed, but something in her face had. A flicker of uncertainty broke the stillness around her eyes. She blinked once, then again, but said nothing. JD's voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened. I've carried this with me since I was 12. My mother had just come home from a mental health hold. We hadn't eaten in 2 days. The first time I ever bought food by myself, I paid with that stamp. Beans, rice, and powdered milk. That was our dinner. For a week, a rustle of paper from a staffer across the room was the only interruption. No one else moved. JD tapped the stamp gently. This isn't a prop. This isn't proof. This is memory. He let the line breathe, then finished. She said I was pretending to speak for the poor. But I don't speak for them. I remember them, because I was one. The words weren't grand. There was no rhetorical flourish, just truth, standing unadorned in the center of a room that often forgot what real stories sounded like. JD sat back in his chair, letting the silence resume its reign. For a moment, even the chairman hesitated. Crockett blinked again, her jaw tight, hands folded too perfectly still. She wasn't the target, but something in her had clearly been struck. Outside the hearing, Twitter was already catching fire. Photos of the food stamp hit the wire before JD had even closed the folder. But inside the room, no one clapped, no one interrupted, because the most powerful sound that day wasn't applause, it was quiet. JD didn't move the food stamp. It sat there, small and unassuming, but more commanding than any filibuster. He looked down at it again, not as a token, but as a time machine. Then he raised his eyes to the room and spoke again. I was 12 the night I first used that. The words weren't read from a statement. They weren't rehearsed. They emerged like breath rising from winter ground, raw and visible. My mom had just come home from the hospital. She wouldn't get out of bed. We had nothing in the fridge except baking soda and an expired mustard packet. So I walked 5 blocks in the dark, holding that food stamp like it was breakable. His voice didn't crack, but it weighed heavier now, like each sentence was pulling a stone from his chest. The Kroger was lit up like a stadium. I remember the brightness hurting my eyes after being in the house all day. I didn't look at anyone, just grabbed beans, rice, a can of chili. I walked up to the register praying I'd done it right. He paused. No papers rustled. No aides whispered. Even the chairman leaned slightly forward. The cashier didn't say much, didn't look at me long, just scanned, took the stamp, and handed me a receipt. JD looked down at the stamp again. I kept it because that night I thought, if I ever make it, I need to remember what got me through. A beat passed, then another. I wore a collared shirt to school, not because I had class, but to hide the holes. I learned to eat slow so the hunger didn't catch up too fast. I stopped talking about what was real because people laughed when you did. He looked around the room now, not angrily, but like he was searching for the ones who might understand. I don't share this to earn pity or applause or a headline. I share it because if people like me don't speak up, someone else will rewrite it, and they'll leave out the parts that burn. Cameras caught Crockett sitting motionless, eyes fixed but unreadable. Her earlier confidence hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. Less performance, more calculation. She'd come prepared for debate. She hadn't come prepared for memory. JD continued. You know, the first story I ever told was a lie. I told a teacher I had allergies. Truth was, my stomach hurt because I hadn't eaten since Saturday. His hand moved slowly to the folder and closed it with quiet finality. That's the story they forget. The one between the headlines. The one lived in houses without working locks, with lights that flicker even when the bill's paid. He looked back to the committee. You can call it anecdotal. You can say it's the past. But if someone in this room still thinks I'm pretending, then I invite you to keep this. He slid a second slip of paper across the table. A scanned copy of the original receipt, yellowed but intact. 30 years. I've kept that piece of paper for 30 years. Not because I needed proof, but because I needed a reminder. The cameras didn't move. No one spoke. Because in that moment, the story wasn't JD's alone anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever felt hunger and stayed quiet about it. JD looked across the committee one last time, not to persuade, not to provoke, but to hold their gaze. Some stared at the table, others at the folder, a few only at him. This wasn't a performance, he said, his voice level. This was survival. A silence settled so thick it made even the floor seem hesitant to creak. I didn't come here to change your minds. I came here to remind you that millions of Americans never had the luxury of pretending this kind of story away, and many of them still don't. He glanced briefly at Crockett. She looked back, chin lifted, but her expression unreadable. Not defiant, not conceding, just still. The ones still using that food stamp today, he continued, they deserve a voice, not a punchline. His words weren't loud, but they carried like a drumbeat behind glass. Controlled, deep, inescapable. JD reached down, calmly slid the laminated stamp back into the folder, and closed it with quiet precision. Then without another word, he stood up, nodded once to the committee, and turned to leave. No papers shuffled, no chair scraped. Even the stenographer paused for a breath too long. Behind him, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She had no follow-up, no interruption, no rebuttal. Her hands were folded, fingers tight. Her eyes didn't follow him out. In the press gallery, someone finally exhaled. A young reporter, maybe an intern, whispered just loud enough for the nearby mic to catch. He just ended the conversation. The words echoed in the silence left behind, not as commentary, but as recognition. Not just that JD had spoken, but that no one knew how to follow him. Outside the chamber, the hallway buzzed to life. Journalists tapped frantically on phones, producers barked edits into earpieces, and interns rushed toward elevators, clutching new headlines they hadn't expected to write that morning. But JD didn't linger. He walked straight through the chaos with the same unhurried rhythm he brought into the room. One step after another, his hands tucked behind the folder, as if carrying something sacred. Not for display, but for safekeeping. One cameraman caught a final shot from the back. JD's silhouette framed by the seal of the Capitol and the daylight beyond its tall windows. The frame would loop for hours on every network. No lower third, no banner. Just the image of a man who didn't raise his voice, but quieted a room anyway. Inside, back at the committee table, Jasmine reached for her pen and didn't write. Instead, she looked at the chair JD had left behind. Empty, still, but somehow louder now than any accusation that had flown across the aisle minutes earlier. The hearing hadn't been officially adjourned, but everyone knew it was over, because what had just happened wasn't strategy. It wasn't theater. It wasn't politics as usual. It was something far more rare. It was the kind of moment that reminded people, on both sides, why truth, when told without apology, doesn't need applause to resonate. It just needs the silence that follows. The projector flickered to life in a sunlit high school classroom in Ohio. The walls were lined with posters about civic duty and Supreme Court decisions, but the students, half slouched in hoodies, half scrolling under desks, barely noticed. At the front, Mr. Leland, a civics teacher known more for his dry humor than passion, paused the noise. "All right," he said, clicking the remote. "I want you to watch this." No questions. Not yet. The video began. JD Vance at the committee table. His voice calm, his tone steady. The food stamp, faded and laminated, placed before him with the reverence of a flag folded for a final goodbye. The class leaned in, not by instruction, but by instinct. Something in the air shifted, like the classroom got smaller. No music, no cuts. Just that moment. The ones still using it deserve a voice, not a punchline. The screen faded to black. Mr. Leland didn't say anything. He let the silence stretch, just like JD had. A beat passed, then another, and then. Why did they laugh at him? A girl asked quietly from the third row. Her name was Cassie, a junior. Usually quick with sarcasm, today she looked genuinely confused. Mr. Leland tilted his head and crossed his arms. Because silence scares people who speak too often. A boy in the back scoffed. That's deep. Leland smiled faintly. So was what you just saw. Another student raised a hand, then lowered it. Was he poor for real? Someone asked. Mr. Leland nodded. Yeah. Poor like turning on the faucet and nothing comes out. Poor like pretending to forget lunch so you don't have to admit you don't have one. The class sat still for a long second. Cassie leaned forward. So she, Crockett, thought he was just faking? That's what she said, that he never lived it. But he did. He did, Mr. Leland agreed. And instead of arguing, he brought the receipt. Someone chuckled. Literally. The class laughed, but softly. Not the kind of laugh that mocks, the kind that comes when a truth sinks in so deep it displaces your assumptions. Mr. Leland moved to the whiteboard and wrote in bold marker, "Who decides what pain looks like?" He underlined it once, then turned back. So, who does? One student muttered, "People with microphones." Another, "People who've never had to use food stamps." Another, "People who are scared someone might remember." Mr. Leland didn't correct them. He just nodded. Then he added another line beneath it. And what happens when pain speaks for itself? Cassie raised her hand again. Why didn't he yell back at her? Mr. Leland paused. Because some stories aren't arguments. They're anchors. The bell rang, but no one rushed. A few students lingered, packing slowly. Cassie stood by the door, glancing back at the paused video still showing JD mid-sentence. Folder closed, chair pulled back slightly as if he was just rising. Was that all real? She asked. Mr. Leland's voice softened. The moment. Yes, the stamp. Yes, the silence. That was the realest part of all. Cassie didn't say anything. She walked out the door with the others, the image still hanging in her head. And on the board behind them, the words remained. Who decides what pain looks like? By dawn the next morning, the clip had already crossed 5 million views. The hashtag he was there trended across all platforms, starting modestly with a repost by a small veterans account, then swelling like a tide. What began as a whispered moment in a congressional room had become something else entirely. A reckoning, a mirror. Twitter, normally home to snark and skepticism, began folding in on itself. A former Hill staffer posted, "Never thought I'd say this. I've disagreed with JD Vance on nearly every policy, but not with that story. Not anymore." A progressive activist with a blue checkmark and a known distaste for conservatives added, "That was not a performance. That was memory in real time, and it left a scar." Within hours, a quiet flood of personal stories joined the thread. One woman wrote, "I had the same kind of envelope. Snap 1992. I still have the card. I used it the day I dropped out of college to take care of my mom." Then came the post no one expected. It was a grainy, sun-faded photo. A boy with patched jeans and a worn backpack, crouching by a chain-link fence, handing a sandwich to another kid. Caption, "That's JD. He didn't talk about us. He was one of us." Middletown, Ohio. The account belonged to Teresa McGill, a retired school bus driver who hadn't posted in over a year. No hashtags, no grand claims, just a memory laid bare. The tweet exploded, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, honest, hard to refute. A journalist reshared it with the words, Politics aside, this is what truth looks like when you stop yelling long enough to hear it. On cable networks, commentary softened. The usual media polarity blurred. Pundits who had once written JD off as a populist in a tailored suit were rewatching the footage. This time, not just the speech, but the pauses, the restraint, the silence between each sentence that somehow said more than words ever could. Back in JD's office, his aide entered with a laptop in hand, eyes wide. "You're trending," she said. JD barely looked up from his desk, where he was scribbling on the same notepad he'd used to draft his statement days earlier. "I figured," he muttered. She waited a moment. "There's a request from CNN, morning show. They want to know if you'll—" "No," JD said, closing the pad. "This wasn't for them." "But the response—" JD turned slowly, calm but firm. "If the story is doing its job, it doesn't need me explaining it again." She nodded. Outside, in a distant part of Ohio, a group of steelworkers on break sat watching the clip on one of their phones. None of them said a word until it ended. Then one of them, older, calloused hands wrapped around a thermos, grunted. "Didn't think much of him before, but he told the damn truth." In a small apartment in Newark, a single mother whispered "thank you" to no one in particular as she rewound the video for a third time. And in Middletown, where it all started, Teresa McGill added a second tweet. "I hope he knows. We saw him. Even then." The replies filled quickly. "We see him now." The lights in the studio were low, softened to a warm tone that made the moment feel less like news and more like confession. Jasmine Crockett sat on a stool opposite the host, legs crossed, palms resting on her lap. Gone was the firebrand posture, the courtroom cadence. Tonight her voice carried something quieter, measured, unguarded. The host leaned forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've become the face of a lot of conversations lately, especially after last week's hearing." Jasmine nodded. "Yes, I've seen the coverage." A pause. The host raised an eyebrow. "Do you regret what you said?" Jasmine took a breath. "I don't regret fighting for the poor. That part of me will never change. But," she exhaled slowly, "I've learned not to assume I'm the only one who came from nothing." The camera didn't cut away. It stayed on her face, eyes clear, mouth set in a line that was neither defensive nor apologetic, just real. The host glanced at a cue card but didn't use it. "That's a big shift." "It is," Jasmine replied. "When I first saw him walk into that hearing, I thought he was showing up for image. Suits, cameras, optics. I thought he was here to posture, not to remember." The host asked carefully, "And now?" "I don't know what pain looks like in every man, but I know what it looks like behind the eyes when someone stops pretending." She paused. "I saw that in him, and it stopped me." There was a moment of silence between them, not the kind that begged for interruption, but the kind that deserved to linger. The host cleared his throat. "You ever talk to him? J.D. Vance?" Jasmine looked down for the first time, her thumb tracing the edge of her cuff. Then she looked up again. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Not yet," she said, "but I listened." The words hovered. The host let the answer breathe before moving on, sensing this wasn't a moment to force into a headline. It was a moment that had unfolded, delicately, and only after the noise had cleared. Later that night, the clip circulated online, but it didn't explode like the others had. It moved like a quiet ripple through communities that had long felt ignored. In a church basement in Milwaukee, a group of community leaders paused their usual meeting to watch it on someone's phone. One of them, a retired librarian named Elise, said, "Growth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and that's louder than pride." In the comments section of the video, someone wrote, "Maybe the greatest thing she did was stop talking long enough to hear the man she disagreed with." And in a modest apartment in D.C., JD watched the interview alone, the room dimly lit, the volume turned just high enough to catch every syllable. When Jasmine said, "But I listened," JD didn't smile. He just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and whispered something only the walls heard. "Good." Then he reached into a drawer, pulled out a folded piece of paper, Teresa McGill's printed tweet, and placed it gently in a file labeled "Still Matters." Outside, the city moved on, unaware that something rare had just taken root in its halls. Mutual recognition, not of politics, but of pain. The office was quiet, even when it wasn't. Phone calls came and went, interns buzzed through with folders and clipped voices, but somehow within J.D. Vance's inner workspace, there was always stillness. It was the kind of stillness that didn't just happen, it was chosen, preserved. On the back wall behind his desk, nestled between two portraits, one of his grandmother, the other of a rusted Ohio steel mill, hung a single modest black frame. It wasn't ornate, no gold trim, no official seal, just clean glass and dark oak, polished but plain. Inside the frame, two items. First, a laminated 1994 food stamp, faded slightly from age, edges softened by time but intact. Clear enough that the numbers still told a story of rationed meals and counted cans. Second, a handwritten note in JD's slanted pen. It read, "This was dinner. This was proof." That was all. No explanation, no timeline. Just memory, crystallized. Visitors noticed it immediately. Staffers, journalists, senators, foreign dignitaries. Some would ask directly, pointing with the hesitation of those unsure if it was appropriate. "Senator, may I ask about the frame?" JD never avoided the question. He'd lean back in his chair, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling faintly. "That's where I'm from," he would say. "Not just geographically, spiritually." And then he'd say no more, because it didn't need more. The story was in the silence, in the placement of the frame, not behind glass in a museum, but within arm's reach of every decision he made. Sometimes aides would catch him glancing at it mid-meeting, particularly during debates on food insecurity, education reform, or welfare policy. Not as a gesture, not for show, but as a compass, a grounding wire. Once, during a private conversation, a fellow senator leaned over and asked quietly, "Do you really think that old food stamp changed anything?" JD had replied without flinching, "No, I changed. That just reminded me why." And on days when the work felt like shouting into a void, when the politics threatened to drown the purpose, that frame remained, unmoving, undeniable. It arrived on a Wednesday, a plain envelope among dozens of others. JD almost missed it, but his chief of staff flagged it. "This one's handwritten," she said, tapping the corner. "From a kid." Middletown, Ohio. JD paused. Later that evening, with the sun low and bleeding orange through the blinds, he sat in his office alone and opened it. Inside was a letter in graphite pencil, slightly smudged. No punctuation in some places. Every word mattered more because of it. "Dear Mr. Vance, they laugh at me because I wear the same shoes every day. My mom says we'll get new ones when her second job pays. But I don't think they're coming soon. I saw you on YouTube. My teacher played the clip where you showed the stamp. I didn't know senators had to be hungry once. I just wanted to ask, does it ever get easier?" JD folded the letter slowly, sat with it for a full 10 minutes before touching his pen. Then he began to write. "Dear Tyler, first, thank you, not just for writing me, but for standing in shoes that not many people see and still walking forward. You asked if it gets easier. Not always, but you'll get stronger. You'll outgrow those shoes, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. And when you do, you'll carry the strength they gave you. Until then, wear them like armor. Every step you take in them is proof, and you're not alone. I used to think the worn parts of me were weaknesses. Turns out they were warnings to never forget where I started. Keep going. I'll be cheering you on. Senator J.D. Vance." He folded the note carefully, included a small lapel pin from his campaign days, a worn-out silver Ohio Rises emblem. No explanation, just a symbol. J.D. addressed the envelope himself, then walked it down to the mailbox on the corner outside his building. No aid, no press. As he slid it in, he thought of that frame behind him, and now this kid, writing forward from the same place he once stood still. And he smiled. The sun was setting behind the Capitol dome, casting long golden shadows across the marble. J.D. Vance stepped out of the building alone, coat folded over his arm, tie loosened but still present. The weight of the day lingered on his shoulders but not heavily. It sat like something familiar. carried, not endured. He walked slowly down the steps. No entourage, no talking points, just the sound of polished shoes on old stone. Across the street, a reporter spotted him and jogged lightly across the plaza. "Senator Vance, quick question. Just a moment, sir?" JD turned slightly, offered a polite smile, but didn't stop walking. Not dismissive, just finished. Behind him, the dome faded into silhouette. Ahead, the city buzzed, horns in the distance, a delivery bike zipping past. But JD walked like a man with nothing to prove and something worth remembering. The reporter, still recording, muttered to his cameraman, "He doesn't need to speak." That hearing clip said it all. Later that night, in the final segment of a national broadcast, the video aired silently. JD crossing the plaza, the frame steady, no voiceover, no music, just a single line on the screen. They said he hadn't lived it, but he did, and he never left it behind. He just brought it with him, in case someone else needed to see it. Then a final whisper, just text, just truth. Truth doesn't raise its voice, it stands quietly and stays. And in homes across America, people didn't applaud. They didn't shout, they just sat with it. Some remembered their own food stamps, others their old shoes, a few picked up pens. But most just listened, finally to the quiet that had always been speaking. This story reminds us that true leadership doesn't always come from the loudest voices or the most polished speeches, but from the quiet courage of lived experience. J.D. Vance didn't respond with anger or theatrics. He answered with a laminated food stamp, a memory, and a message. In doing so, he reminded us that the scars of the past aren't weaknesses, they're proof of survival. His silence said more than shouting ever could. It's a powerful reflection on empathy, humility, and the need to look deeper before we judge. Question for you. Have you ever been misunderstood because of where you came from, or surprised by someone else's quiet strength? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.